Welcome back. We're now ready to compare our two models. So remember, we have one model where we assume that 1% of people who end up catching the COVID-19 end up dying, and in the other, it's 0.5%. We really have no idea what that number is. No one really knows how many people have been infected. That's the problem. We have a pretty good sense of how many people have died from COVID-19, especially as the weeks have gone along. Initially, there may have been people may have died and they didn't realize it was COVID-19. And as time went on, we have better tracking. But we have no idea how many people actually have been infected as we have gone along, and that's what our models can show us, is how many people may have been infected depending on what assumptions we make about the death rate. So let us go over to MATLAB and see how the two different models play out. And obviously there could be another percentage that is the correct percentage that would be more accurate. So we don't know which model is the correct model at this point, but a 0.5% death rate is obviously much more optimistic than a 1% death rate. So let's see how those two things do in fact play out. Okay, so I'm going to start with the less optimistic model, the 1% death rate. And let's look at how that plays out. So we can see the infection stayed below the threshold. And later on, I'm assuming that I'm going to try to stay below that threshold, but I want to open up my economy. So I picked A values that would bring us back up toward the threshold line, but would not, in fact, go over it. In the long run, at the end of this model, we can see we always increase A. So we can see, whoops, that's the death matrix. Here's the A matrix. So you can see in the speculation zone, the values for A keep going up. But eventually, we kind of run out of fuel, and there are no more susceptible people in the long run. And so we can see that the infections will drop towards 0, even though we keep raising the A value. Okay, so continuing, things that we're interested in are what's going on right now. Okay, so right now let's say we're at week 22. So if I want to know how many people are infected in week 22, remember there are 100 steps per week, that would be I of 2,201. There's that quirky little 1 because we start on step 1, not step 0. So it looks like in this model, right now that would mean at week 22, we're down to about 1.2% being infected. What we're very interested in actually though is how many people have recovered, how many people are immune, all right? So let's actually change the scaling of our graph. So instead of only going up to 8%, let's go all the way up to a little over 100% so we can see what some of these other curves look like. And we can see the susceptible population, that's the dark blue curve, has been dropping, all right? And the purple line, those would be the recovered people who are now immune. That has been rising, okay? So right where we are now. Now we're predicting that those curves are gonna keep dropping and rising in the future, and that's all the speculative part, okay? But right now we can see that the R of 2201 is right there at about 13%, between 13 and 14%, okay? So that leaves somewhere around 86% of the population that is still susceptible. In fact, we could type in S of 2201. So about 83, 84% of the population is still susceptible to getting sick. So there's plenty of fuel left, so to speak, for the virus. And so that plays out with that second wave. There are still a lot of people who could get sick, okay? So this was assuming that for every person who died, there were roughly 100 people who had recovered. So our purple line is about 100 times higher than the black line. So we need to look at those on two different scales. And so that's what we get. Now let's switch over to the 5% model. So if we run this again in the 5% model, okay, those are the two, we can see the infections, but let's look at what happens to our, the number of people who are immune. Okay, so we want to look at the bigger Y scale. Let's go up to 1.1 instead of stopping at 8%. And we can see the purple curve looks like it's up higher. The blue curve has dropped a lot more. Okay, the reason for that is we're assuming it's the same number of people have died. We're using the same data for deaths, but we're assuming that for every one person who died, roughly 200 people are immune. All right, so that's what it would mean to be, you know, have a 0.5% death rate. So one person out of every 200 would die. Okay, so if we look at the number of people who have recovered and are now immune, that number is closer to 25%, and the susceptible population is down at around 70%. Okay, since we have a lower susceptible population, it means that the virus is closer to running its course. Right, it's used up a significantly more of the susceptible population already, so there are fewer people in the future who could still get sick. Right, now that has good consequences. If we look further down, let's shrink our scale again. Let's look at a scale of 0.05. Let's look at a 5% scale here. Okay, we can see that in the long run in this model, maybe let me change that to an 8% scale. We can see in the long run, we stayed below the curve by picking numbers for A, you know, that go up in a very steady fashion. And you can see that every 2 weeks, I am raising the A value by about 0.2. So I'm raising the A value by about 0.1 per week. Okay, so that means we can open the economy up in a very steady way. And the deaths are limited. They're below 1%. So if we look at the maximum of D, there it is. It's a little below 0.5% of the population. Okay, which, by the way, was the percentage we said would die out of the percentage who get sick. So in New Jersey, if we take that number, answer times 9 million, we can see that would total about 42 to 43,000 people. Okay, now considering that we're at 11,000 roughly right now, that's tragic. Okay, but it's not nearly as bad as it is in the other model, where we will in fact peak out with a death rate closer to 1% instead of closer to 0.5%. Okay, now keep track of, there are two things. The death rate will be higher in the 1% model than what we're looking at now. But remember, I've been steadily raising the A value from now all the way into the future. And essentially by the time we get to week 42, when I make the A value 4, that's as if we're doing nothing at all in order to prevent the virus. So that's pretty much back to the natural rate of transmission. And the virus has petered out. Even by week 42, I don't have to do anything. We've used up the susceptible population, and the infection rate is just going to drop because there just aren't people to still get sick. So with that in mind, in fact, you can see the blue line here. That's how many are left being susceptible. It's just under 6% of the population is still susceptible by the end. So there's very little fuel to keep the fire burning. Right? If I switch back to the other model, when I switch back over to the other model, we can see, let me first of all just run it again. Okay, and let me go back to that 8% for Y max. Okay, and if we look at the maximum of D. That's just under 1%. And if we take that answer times 9 million, we can see that it's more like 83,000 people. Okay, so that's a much, about double the number of people will die if the death rate is in fact 1% instead of 0.5%. Okay, so that makes sense. But there's other bad news here, okay, compared to the model we just worked with. Look at these A values. So especially if you look at the first two, at week 22, I pretty much kept it, it's the same as the other model, it's around 1.2, but I was only able to raise at week 31, that's 9 weeks later, I was only able to raise it by 0.1 in order to stay below the infection threshold line, right? So this would be a very, very slow recovery compared to what we had in the previous model. Okay, so in summary, if we're on a 0.5% as the death rate, if that is in fact true instead of the 1%, it makes a huge difference in how fast we can open up the economy. And also, we can see here that we're not really, even at week 41, we're keeping the ratio, the coefficient for A down at 2. In the other model, I had already, by week 42, I had opened that up to a 4, which essentially means we're not doing anything at all. So we have to keep restrictions much higher for much longer in order to keep from crashing the hospitals. So we're going to run both of these models over the next few weeks and see which one seems to be working. We've had a lot of extra factors that would cause A to go up. We're going to be able to see if there is, in fact, a corresponding increase in the number of deaths per week. And we'll be able to figure out which model is probably the correct model to use. Hopefully, what we'll find out is that even the 0.5% model is overly pessimistic. Maybe we'll find out that it's 0.1% or something like that as we move forward. If the death rate doesn't increase with the opening up of the economy, it might mean that we should be on an even more optimistic model than the 0.5% model. So hopefully, the 0.5% model is actually overly pessimistic, and we'll find out as we track the data further. Remember, we're trying to do a forecast out to 52 weeks with 20 weeks worth of data. So there's a lot that we just don't know, and we will know more and more as time goes on.